Are you sure?
Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never ask a bride why she's getting married. Don't wear a skirt on a windy day. Deodorant is not a shower. Don't sniff chili flakes. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Macro Sutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint. This time we're going to be talking about climate change. Now, we know that there's all kinds of things that are happening that bother all of us. Erratic rainfall, summers that are too long and too hot, winters that are too short and sometimes too cold. But this affects us as individuals. What we're going to discuss today is the impact that this is having on various sectors on the economy and how vulnerable these sectors actually are and what we can do to actually help and make sure that these sectors are more resilient. To discuss all of this, as always, we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us.
Thank you, Sharad.
So now, Radhika, let's lay out the problem statement, as it were. How vulnerable is India to climate change?
So we know that India is vulnerable because of its unique geographical position. But also if we look at the various indices, there are a number of global indices that rank countries based on their vulnerability to climate change.
Right.
And if we look at those indices, we find that India is amongst the top 10. So there is one
Most
vulnerable countries, most impacted by disaster risks, most affected in terms of fatalities and in terms of economic losses. So most important is the global climate risk index that places India on the seventh most vulnerable, most affected by climate change, and it looks at the impact of climate change on countries in terms of fatalities and economic losses.
Right.
So there are countries like Zimbabwe, Bahamas, and then on number 7 is India. So India is amongst the top 10 countries. Then there's another risk index which is as part of the World Risk Report, which places India at number 3 amongst the most vulnerable countries. So they look at something called exposure and vulnerability.
Right.
That is, how exposed you are, and once you are exposed, how vulnerable you are. It may well be that a country is exposed, but they may not be too much vulnerable.
They might be more resilient.
They might be more resilient. They may not be that sensitive to climate change. They may have coping capacities to make climate resilient infrastructure and so on. And going by that index, also India features as one of the top 3, in fact, amongst the countries that are affected by climate change. So globally, we do see that whatever index we may take, India does feature as one of the countries most impacted by disaster risks and also more vulnerable to climate change.
Right. So, when people talk about global warming, climate change, it's not as if the impact is felt equally around the world. Clearly, India is in a bad place in this respect. But of course, when we talk about India, we've seen in various data that you can't aggregate the whole country, that some places will be worse affected than others. So which are the states that are particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, so here also there are a lot of studies that are conducted within the country. There is an important study which is conducted by the Department of Science and Technology. And they say that there are 8 states, and those are primarily the eastern region states, the northeast and the eastern region states, Assam, Bihar, Odisha, Mizoram. These are some of the states that are highly vulnerable to climate change. Now, their study is ongoing. They are going to come up with similarly a list of states that may be exposure, then where they study exposure to climate change. So this is they have identified, they have a ranking of all states based on vulnerability. And there we find that there are these 8 states which are highly vulnerable in terms of ranking. So they have high vulnerable, medium, and so on. So highly vulnerable states are these 8 states which are part of the eastern region, namely, as I said, Bihar is there, Odisha is there, Mizoram is there, so all the eastern Jharkhand is there. So these are some of the states that are vulnerable to climate change. There's another study conducted by the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, and they have again looked at the way globally it is done, the assessment is done, which is a composite of exposure, vulnerability, or coping capacity, and so on. And they have identified states, again, some are common, but there are some which are different as well. So Assam, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra. These are some of the states that feature amongst the more vulnerable states that are identified by the Council of Energy, Environment and Water. Now, these studies are very important because they lay the groundwork for designing policies, for designing adaptation policies. More important is that climate change is real, we cannot escape that. So it is important that we develop resilience, we develop adaptive strategies, and that should be part of the climate action plan. And so once we have these studies, there can be localized policy interventions to design adaptation strategies.
Right, as we've seen, I mean, there's no one size fits all policy that ever works in India.
Yes.
There's so much difference between various states that you need to localize your policies. So now, okay, so geographically, these are the more vulnerable areas. But now, economically, do we have an idea which sectors in particular face a lot of stress from the climate?
So naturally, agriculture is
Of
one
course.
sector and there are various transmission channels through which climate change can impact agriculture. And there are various concerning studies that highlight the impact of climate change on agriculture. There is one study which is on the very recent study on the state of marginal farmers in India.
Right, it just came out.
Just came out a few days back. And so it is talking in general about the state of marginal farmers. It's a survey of the state of marginal farmers. And one of the question asked in that survey is how has climate change or disasters affected the marginal farmers? And an overwhelmingly large proportion of these farmers state that they were able to harvest less than half of what they could have harvested in a normal year. So they have lost more than half of their produce due to climate change. And more concerning is the fact that the smaller marginal farmers that have very small land holding up to 0.5 acres of land, they are disproportionately more impacted by climate change, and therefore then their livelihood is impacted, and then they have to depend on working as a wage laborer in either other fields or in non-agricultural sectors.
Right.
So crop loss is one very definitive impact. The other is loss of labor productivity. Because of the extreme heat, there is loss of labor productivity.
Of course, you can't work as
You
much.
can't work that much. What you could have worked for 4 hours, you have to work for more number of hours. And that is, there for any outdoor activity. That applies to construction activities also. That applies to industry also, that climate change impacts the sector's productivity because of the number of hours worked that are potentially lost. And there is absenteeism from work. Because health is impacted because of extreme heat. There is tiredness due to extreme heat. So those are some of the mechanisms through which climate change impacts agriculture. And then there is a very recent report by Moody's that has highlighted that, in fact, it has gone ahead to say that climate change can have an impact on India's credit rating.
Oh.
We are at one point looking at improving our credit rating, and here the report says that because of climate change there could be impact on India's credit strength, again because of one of the reason is agriculture, that agriculture could lead to productivity losses, it could lead to high food inflation.
Right.
A falling income that could lead to social unrest, and that could hamper the economy's ability to withstand shocks, which is one of the very important parameter that they look to assess the credit profile of countries. So that is one reason that that is again one important sector which is impacted. The other sectors are the industry. Within industry, we talked about the thermal coal power plant and steel, because particularly these are impacted because of their water intensive nature.
Right, and we're talking about water scarcity,
water shortage, and because our production processes are highly water intensive, particularly for steel, so there could be impact for these sectors as well.
Right. So that's actually several core sectors of our economy. You're talking about agriculture, coal, steel, these construction.
Yes, and MSMEs. Basically, if you look at our informal sector, that is disproportionately impacted by climate change because they do not have those adequate safeguard mechanisms. They do not have the ability to undertake adaptation strategies, so they are more impacted. So there is greater hand-holding required of these sectors so that they develop resilience to climate change.
Right. So now let's focus a little bit on agriculture because, as we know, I mean, it employs so many people in the country. So now, what are the steps, particularly in agriculture, that the government needs to take to protect against the impact of climate change?
Yes, so there, work is required on, we can say, multiple fronts. One is that, we need to focus, the government needs to focus on climate resilient varieties of seed. That is very important because otherwise the productivity losses would continue. And that in turn requires investment in agriculture R&D. One thing that maybe we should look for in the budget is if there is some stepping up of expenditure for agricultural research and development, because that is very much needed to develop climate resilient seeds. So that is one very important thing. The other is, of course, investment in irrigation, water storage facilities. A lot of steps are also required to develop mitigation strategies in the form of early warning systems for climate change. Farmers need to be told that there could be this problem, there could be this onset of flood or drought, so you need to prepare accordingly. So that is another kind of work area which is needed. So we need climate resilient seeds, we need water, we need infrastructure development, we need water storage. And then another important thing is that we need to put in place some incentive mechanisms so that farmers could be incentivized to focus more on those crops which are less water intensive.
Right.
That
Things
is
like
something.
Paddy is very
water intensive. So if there could be incentives to move towards pulses and millets, that would help to reduce our import requirements as well as involve lesser water. So these are all needed to safeguard our water shortage, address water shortage as well. So these are some of the steps that are needed.
The other crop as well that we have been actually trying to increase production is sugarcane.
Sugarcane, yeah.
Which is again very water intensive.
So paddy, sugarcane, if we can move away and move towards millet and pulses.
Millets are very good.
So millets are good, and we have been promoting that. So these are some of the steps, conjunction of steps that could be taken to make agriculture resilient, and also handholding of farmers and educating them, sensitizing them on the role of climate change and on the need to store water, and tell them about the various policies, agri-insurance, and so on.
So now you've outlined the various steps that can be taken, but a lot of them are very costly steps. Right. So financing this is something that again needs to be a policy priority. Right. So let's look at various ways that we can finance, going green, as it were. Say first from the public sector. We'll talk about the private sector after.
Yeah, so we need both low cost public finance, and part of this has to come from international bodies and advanced economies. A lot of discussion has taken place in these various COP summits, the COP summits. Right. And in 2009, the advanced economies had committed to provide $100 billion of mobilization of funds every year to emerging and developing economies. And even in 2020, we did not reach that level. Right. And in fact, there is also a debate on the nature of funding, because what the emerging economies or developing economies need is more in the form of grants and concessional finance. What they are getting is more in the form of loans, which is further deteriorating their fiscal position, increasing their debt burden, and not helping so much them in in developing climate resilient infrastructure and so on. So there India has played a very important role. India is now saying that, we need $1 trillion, emerging economies as a whole. Developed economies should contribute $1 trillion every year. And for India as such, we need cumulatively, based on the estimates by the government, based on their commitments, the net zero goal of 2070, we need $10 trillion of investments cumulatively.
Right.
But what we have been able to garner is a very small proportion. So there is a considerable funding gap which needs to come from this flow of both public finance as well as private finance. So there is now the COP29 that is going to happen in Baku in November. So emerging economies will put forth their case for augmenting the flow of finance, and particularly concessional finance from developed economies to developing economies. So, because even $100 billion was not met. So we are thinking of now increasing. Will that be met? What will be the nature?
And we're talking about trillions now.
Trillions, yeah. We are talking about trillions. So that is a very contentious issue, but we have to keep trying and make progress on that respect.
No, of course. And the balance between the two is that the developed countries want the developing countries to cut their emissions.
Correct.
The developing countries are saying that, look, we need to grow.
We need to grow.
And,
you have been the historical emitters. You have passed through that stage where you emitted, and now when we are growing, you are asking us to cut. So help us in cutting and help us in developing the adaptation strategies towards those.
Absolutely. So now that's public finance, but other ways that private finance can also be leveraged to finance, this green finance, as they call it.
Yes. So there are various instruments. We've talked about earlier about sovereign green bonds, and now last year RBI came up with a framework of green deposits, where banks were asked to garner green deposits, so we can our deposits can be used to finance some green projects. The list is already there on the guidelines, as part of the guidelines for green deposits, which include things like renewable energy, adaptation, sustainable water, waste management, afforestation. So there is a list of sectors, or the list of projects in which the proceeds from green deposits would be utilized. And banks have to, there is a format within which the banks have to tell to the RBI what the proceeds were used for. So that is the green deposit framework, where banks are the main facilitators. And then there's the sovereign green bond, where the government issues these bonds. And last year, FY24, the amount attained through green bond was 20,000 crore.
Okay.
Again, the problem is that there is a misalignment between the issuers and the investor. There's a risk-return trade-off. The investors who are investing, they are not quite clear about the viability of returns. Initially, there's a lot of cost. There is gestation period. There's uncertainty about viability of returns. So sometimes they don't go through. Like we saw that for the first tranche, the first auction of green bonds for this financial year did not go through, because the investors were asking for higher interest, higher yield on the green bonds, but RBI and the government was not in favor. So there's misalignment there. So that is one inherent problem which would need to be improved over time. That balancing needs to be done in the form of managing the imperatives of green financing, as well as ensuring that it's a viable investment option for the investors.
So now, so we've talked about how vulnerable India is, which parts of India are vulnerable, which sectors are vulnerable, and what are the various steps that can be taken. But now we have several questions from the audience, some of which are a little more on a conceptual basis. Karthik asks, will we be able to manage growth sustainably, or do we have to pick one? Either you pick growth or you pick sustainability.
So we have to manage both. We have to grow sustainably. That is important, because right now what is happening is that we are growing, but there are concerns around sustainability, which will in the long run, or even in the medium term, it will slow down our growth, because we've talked about the various measures through which it will slow down. And in fact, there are a lot of estimates on how climate change would impact GDP. And there are lots of studies which says that the impact of climate change on GDP could range somewhere between between 3 to 10%. The loss to GDP due to climate change could be between 3 to 10%. That is not only for India. There's a very recent paper by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Globally, they say that, at the very peak, the loss to GDP could be around 12% due to climate change. So it's not that we can leave aside the aspect of sustainability. We have to grow sustainably. Of course, there will be risks. There are these transition risks that we have to, when we move from non-green to green, there are a lot of costs that we have to incur. There are a lot of risks. The financial institutions need to prepare for these risks based on their exposure. So all that will happen, but we cannot ignore the sustainability aspect, because if we ignore, it will hamper the growth path.
Right. It's basically the trade-off between a relatively lower cost right now or potentially a very high
Much
cost
higher
later.
cost, correct. Yes.
Right. So now Gautam asks, he says that food inflation has been sticky for quite a long time. And given that it's directly related to adverse climate conditions, are there some policy measures that you anticipate? Since the interest rate hikes by the RBI in the past haven't really helped in this regard.
So here again, we can talk about the various measures that we talked about for agriculture.
Seeds
How to make agriculture more resilient, and that will improve the resilience of agriculture to climate change, and will also help in addressing the problem of food inflation. Because when your production is not impacted too much by climate change, then inflation will be addressed. It will be controlled. So again, as I said, we can talk about the same factors. Basically investment in resilient seeds, climate
R&D.
resilient seeds, agriculture, R&D, irrigation, very important, water storage, very important, how to think about which crops to grow, that is again very important. So all these things will, in the medium term, going to address the problem of food inflation, because this time around in the last 2 years, the food inflation that we are seeing has been exacerbated due to climate change.
Absolutely. So now Sankalp addresses this the issue of climate change from a completely different sector. He asks, he says that Maruti seems to be betting big on hybrids, and there are also, of course, a lot of other companies that are going very strongly in the EV route. Do you think that inadequate EV infrastructure will persist for a long time? Even Digital India was once thought to be impossible in India, but now India is a global leader in things like UPI. Also, how are we progressing on the goal of phasing out coal?
So, as regards, if we first talk about phasing out of coal, we changed this nomenclature when we met at the international discourse. It has changed it to phasing down, then later there was this change from phase, because we cannot just do away with coal.
No,
so it has to be phasing down, and then the latest nomenclature is transitioning away. So, the various members agreed to this nomenclature. So, it was considered as a big victory for India, because this was the case which was propounded by India, that, we can't talk about phasing down. It will have a lot of destabilization impact on employment and all the other.
We need it for growth.
We need for growth. So, it has to be gradually transitioning away from coal. And if we look at all these, the various goals, we have what is called the nationally determined contribution. And there were some intermittent contributions, some objectives that were fixed for 2030. And till 2022, we have done better than what we have, what we had envisaged for ourselves for 2030. Like the non-fossil energy sources, our reliance on non-fossil energy sources, we have increased as compared to what the goal was set for 2030. So, in fact, we are doing better than our nationally determined contributions in terms of moving towards renewable energy and towards non-fossil fuel. But the fact is that there cannot be a complete phase down of coal.
Right. And the other on EV infrastructure?
Yeah, EV infrastructure, we are slowly moving. That the fact is that it takes time, as he rightly pointed out. It takes time. There will be some policy formulation, then there will be some time towards policy implementation. We need to have the incentive framework set right. So definitely we are moving towards that path, but it will be something that will take some time.
Okay. And now Mridul asks quite a timely question, especially given that the EU is implementing this carbon tax on imports. So he asks, are carbon taxes And cap and trade policy is really effective. And should India also implement these? Yes, India is moving towards that direction. But recently, the CEA released a series of articles, one of which says that empirical evidence is that the performance of these kind of policies is actually very poor. So, what's the truth and the way forward?
See, the way forward is that we have to live with carbon taxes. EU has already imposed carbon taxes. We are already in that timeline where we have to disclose the emissions. We have started with that transition phase, and I think 2026 onward, carbon taxes would be imposed. There is this cap and trade system, and then there is carbon tax and CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which the EU has imposed. We have a paper on that where we have studied the potential impact and what India can do. So this is something which is for real, and what we need to do is to design our own carbon tax mechanism so that we can claim deductions from the EU carbon tax mechanism.
Right.
What is happening is that we need to understand why EU imposed this carbon tax to address the risk of carbon leakage. What was happening is that domestically they had this cap and trade mechanism. Domestically they had this safeguard. So there were imports of low cost items,
Right.
low cost items which were high in carbon content.
So, they were basically outsourcing their pollution.
Yes. So, to address that, they have imposed carbon tax on their imports also, at the same carbon price at which the carbon price which is levied within the domestic economy, to address the risk of carbon leakage. So this is for real, and from 2026 we have to, what the exporters have to do. Like we are exporting steel to EU, exporters will have to purchase what is called a CBAM certificate, which will based on the amount of carbon that is emitted in the production process. So what we need to have is mechanisms to measure carbon pricing, to have adequate safeguards and methods to measure carbon pricing, and to have a carbon market and to have carbon tax so that we can claim deduction from carbon taxes which are imposed by the EU. At the same time, we need to invest on monitoring our emissions, because that is something very important as of now, because right now we are in the process of disclosing to them. They have a format of disclosing that, okay, in 1 ton of steel, how much carbon is being emitted. So do we have proper mechanisms to measure the carbon intensity of production, the emission intensity? So there we need to have methods to measure and measure emission intensity that will then pave the way for reducing the emission intensity, that will pave the way for reducing our tax liability and so on. So this is because these are evolving subjects, so it may well be that their performance as of now may not be that strong. But the thing is that all countries, most countries are experiencing, they are mulling this idea of having a carbon tax. So India cannot escape from this. So we need to have adequate safeguards in place. We already have a carbon credit mechanism in India. We need to move forward towards that and focus more on monitoring the emission intensity of production and developing a carbon taxation mechanism.
Okay, so there you go. I mean, that's the entire picture just there. We know that India is particularly vulnerable to climate change and global warming. We rank very high up in the vulnerability indices that have come out on this issue. Within that, there are several states, particularly towards the east of the country, that are very, very vulnerable. And when you come to sectors, of course, agriculture is very, very vulnerable. But there are others that are very water intensive. Things like steel are, really, they can be impacted. Their output, future output can be impacted because they're very water intensive. When we talk about water scarcity, there are several steps that we need to take. One is in financing, R&D and a lot of research into how to mitigate the impact of climate change on things like agriculture. We need to look into seeds. We need to look into irrigation. We need to invest in water storage. We need to reduce the emissions of a lot of our heavy industries, especially if we want to continue trading with, economic units like the EU. There's a lot to be done, but it needs to be done quickly, because a lot of the data also shows that the impact of climate change on the economy can be as much as 12%. of growth can be sacrificed because of climate change. So we need to move fast as well. But on that note, that's all we have for you. Thank you so much for watching.